1919. The war was over, but people were still dying. The Spanish flu, which began in 1918, reached its deadliest phase in 1919, ultimately killing 50 to 100 million people worldwide. More than the war itself. Imagine that. The most devastating war in human history up to that point, and a virus killed more people than all the bullets, bombs, and gas attacks combined. The Treaty of Versailles was signed in June, and with every stroke of the pen, the diplomats were planting seeds for the next World War. The reparations were designed to cripple Germany for generations. The territorial decisions carved up empires with no regard for the people actually living there. Germany was sliding toward chaos, with communist and fascist factions literally fighting gun battles in the streets. Russia's civil war was in full brutality, with the Red and White armies leaving millions of corpses in their wake, using terror and starvation as weapons. Colonial powers were redrawing the Middle East with arbitrary lines that would cause conflicts for the next century. And in America, the Red Summer saw race riots in dozens of cities, with black communities under attack from white mobs while authorities looked the other way. The war to end all wars had ended, and somehow the world became even more unstable, more violent, more willing to tear itself apart. 1932. The Great Depression reached its darkest depths. In America, unemployment hit 25%, 13 million people out of work. Bread lines stretched for blocks. Families lost everything, watching their homes foreclosed, their savings evaporated, their dignity stripped away. But America's suffering was nothing compared to what was happening in the Soviet Union. Stalin's forced collectivization and grain requisitions had triggered the Holodomor, a man-made famine in Ukraine that would kill 4 to 7 million people. This wasn't a natural disaster. This was deliberate policy. Villages were left with only corpses. People resorted to eating bark, grass, leather, and things we don't speak about. Soviet guards prevented Ukrainians from leaving their regions, ensuring maximum death. They confiscated every scrap of food, every grain of wheat, systematically starving an entire nation into submission. Meanwhile, in Germany, desperation and economic collapse were pushing 6 million unemployed Germans toward a man with a simple message and a scapegoat. The dominoes were falling, one by one. 1932 was the year the world became so desperate, so hungry, so angry, that it was willing to try anything, no matter how dangerous. Before we continue this journey through humanity's darkest moments, make sure you're subscribed and hit that notification bell. These stories need to be remembered, and your support ensures we can keep bringing you history that matters. Now let's descend deeper. 1933. Democracy died not with a bang, but with a vote. January 30th, 1933. Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany through legal means, and within months, the Weimar Republic was a memory. Think about that. One of the most sophisticated democracies in Europe, home to some of the world's greatest artists, scientists, and philosophers, voted fascism into power. The Reichstag fire in February gave him the excuse he needed. The Enabling Act in March gave him the power he craved. By summer, all other political parties were banned. The first concentration camps opened at Dachau. Books burned in public squares while crowds cheered. Jewish businesses were boycotted. Dissidents disappeared in the night. This was the year that proved how quickly freedom can vanish, how easily hatred can be legitimized, how a civilized nation can choose its own destruction. The machinery of the Holocaust was being assembled, piece by piece, law by law, and each step seemed reasonable to those who wanted to believe. The world watched, dismissed it as Germany's internal affair, and did nothing. After all, he was elected. It was legal. What could possibly go wrong? 1941. If we're measuring by sheer scope of catastrophe set in motion, 1941 stands alone. This was the year World War II truly became global and total. Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June with Operation Barbarossa, launching the largest military operation in history. 3 million German soldiers, 600,000 vehicles, 750,000 horses pouring across the border. The goal wasn't just conquest, it was annihilation. The campaign would ultimately kill 27 million Soviet citizens. Soldiers, civilians, men, women, children. Entire villages were erased. Cities were besieged and starved. Pearl Harbor brought America into the war in December, guaranteeing this conflict would consume every continent, every ocean, every corner of human civilization. The Holocaust escalated from persecution to systematic murder. The Einsatzgruppen, mobile killing squads, were executing thousands daily in mass shootings before the death camps were even fully operational. At Babi Yar, they murdered 33,000 Jews in 2 days. The siege of Leningrad began in September, a 900-day nightmare that would starve 1 million people. Mothers watching their children die, people eating wallpaper paste and boiled leather. The Japanese were rampaging through Asia, committing atrocities from China to the Philippines. The rape of Nanking was still fresh. Now they were expanding that horror across an entire continent. Every major power was now committed to total war. Every rule of civilization was being suspended. Every weapon humanity had ever conceived was being deployed. The Geneva Conventions became worthless paper. 1941 didn't just change history, it nearly ended it. The world that existed in January 1941 was gone by December, replaced by something darker, more brutal, and more dangerous than anything before it. And the worst part? The horror had only just begun. 1943. Still World War II raging. The Holocaust reached its peak efficiency. At Auschwitz alone, the gas chambers were killing 10,000 people per day during some periods. The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising was crushed with maximum brutality. The Bengal famine in India, exacerbated by British policy, killed 3 million people. The bombing of Hamburg created the first man-made firestorm, killing 40,000 civilians in a single night. On the Eastern Front, millions died in battles whose names we've forgotten. 1943 wasn't just about battles and territory. It was about how many different ways humanity could inflict death on an industrial scale. The war had transformed from a conflict into a global abattoir. 1957. October 10th, 1957. The Windscale fire in Britain became the world's worst nuclear accident until Chernobyl, releasing radioactive contamination across Europe. But that was just the prelude. This was the year the space race began with Sputnik, militarizing the heavens and intensifying the arms race. The Asian flu pandemic killed between 1 and 4 million people worldwide. In Little Rock, Arkansas, the National Guard had to escort black children to school while mobs screamed for their blood, revealing that America's demons were far from exorcised. The Cold War was entering its most paranoid phase. Nuclear weapons were proliferating. The doomsday clock was ticking closer to midnight. 1957 showed us that even in peacetime, we were finding new ways to threaten our own existence. 1968. The world was burning. From the jungles of Vietnam to the streets of Paris, from Prague to Chicago, 1968 became a year where hope died in real time. Martin Luther King Jr. fell to an assassin's bullet in April. Robert Kennedy followed just 2 months later. The Tet Offensive shattered America's illusions about Vietnam. Soviet tanks crushed the Prague Spring, ending Czechoslovakia's brief taste of freedom. Students rioted in Paris, nearly toppling the French government. The My Lai massacre revealed horrors that would haunt a generation. In Mexico City, the government massacred hundreds of student protesters just days before hosting the Olympics. The year didn't just challenge the established order, it revealed how fragile civilization truly was, how violence lurked just beneath every institution. 1975. Cambodia disappeared. Not literally, but the country that existed in 1974 was erased. When the Khmer Rouge marched into Phnom Penh in April 1975, they didn't just take power, they declared Year Zero. Cities were emptied within days. Millions were forced into the countryside at gunpoint. Money was abolished, schools closed, hospitals shuttered. Wearing glasses could get you killed for being an intellectual. Speaking a foreign language meant death. Over the next 4 years, the Khmer Rouge would murder nearly 2 million people, a quarter of Cambodia's population. But 1975 was when it began, when the world watched another nation descend into madness and did absolutely nothing. The lessons of Rwanda and Darfur were being taught, but nobody was learning. 1983. November of 1983. For a few hours, the world came closer to nuclear annihilation than most people realize. The Soviets, convinced that NATO's Able Archer exercise was cover for a real first strike, put their nuclear forces on high alert. One Soviet officer, Stanislav Petrov, received computer warnings of incoming American missiles. Protocol demanded he report it immediately, triggering a retaliatory strike that would have killed hundreds of millions. He didn't. He trusted his instinct over the machines. He was right. It was a false alarm. But this was also the year of Korean Airlines Flight 007, shot down by Soviet fighters, killing 269 people, including a U.S. congressman. The year Reagan called the Soviet Union an evil empire and announced the Strategic Defense Initiative. The Cold War wasn't just cold in 1983. It was approaching absolute zero, where the slightest miscalculation could have ended everything. We survived 1983 by pure luck. 1994, Rwanda, 100 days, 800,000 people murdered. The math is staggering. That's more than 8,000 deaths every single day. Neighbors killed neighbors, teachers killed students, priests killed parishioners. The world watched, knew what was happening, and did nothing. The United Nations had forces on the ground who were ordered not to intervene. Radio stations broadcast hit lists while machetes did the work that should have required industrial machinery. Romeo Dallaire, the UN commander, begged for just 5,000 troops. He was denied. Bill Clinton would later call it his greatest regret, but regret doesn't resurrect the dead. When the killing finally stopped, it wasn't because humanity intervened, it was because the killers simply ran out of victims in their reach. Rwanda 1994 stands as a monument to the question we still can't answer. How much evil are we willing to tolerate before we act? If you've made it this far, you understand why remembering these years matters. Hit that like button, share this video, and let me know in the comments which year you think deserves to be on this list. History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes, and these lessons are more relevant now than ever. These 10 years remind us that progress isn't inevitable, that civilization is fragile, and that the capacity for evil doesn't disappear just because time passes. The only question is, what will we do with that knowledge?